Redstone Basin, Nevada. Water in the American West is not a resource in the way that most people who have never lived in the American West understand resources. It is the resource, the thing that everything else is either built on or denied by, the original argument and the permanent one, the substance whose ownership determines not merely comfort but survival, and whose allocation in a drought-stricken basin in the high desert is the most consequential decision that any public official can make, and the one most completely invisible to anyone who does not understand specifically and technically how the allocation system works. For 26 years, the water commissioner of Redstone Basin, a man named Curtis Holloway, had been the only person in the county with both the authority to make that decision and the technical knowledge to make it impossible for anyone outside his office to verify whether he was making it honestly. He was not. The investigation that dismantled his 26-year tenure in the spring of 2022 would eventually establish that Holloway had been selling water allocations off the official books to 3 out-of-state agricultural corporations since at least 2007, had been falsifying the basin's aquifer records to conceal the resulting shortfalls, and had, in the process, engineered the financial ruin of dozens of small family farms whose water supplies had been quietly bled off while their allocation certificates told them they had what they needed. 6 of those farms had gone under. 2 of the farmers who lost those farms had died by suicide in the years between the diversion beginning and the investigation uncovering it, deaths that their families had grieved as the consequences of drought and debt and the unmanageable weight of agricultural failure, not understanding, until the investigation made it plain that the drought was real but the debt had been manufactured, that the water their families needed had been there in the aquifer and it had simply, quietly been given to someone else. The investigation began with a satellite. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a hydrologist at the University of Nevada who had been conducting a long-term study of groundwater depletion patterns across 12 western basins using remote sensing data, a research project funded by a federal agricultural resilience grant whose purpose was to model the relationship between groundwater withdrawal rates and surface agricultural productivity across a 20-year period. The Redstone Basin was one of her 12 study sites, and its inclusion in the study was routine, its hydrology unremarkable by the standards of high desert aquifer systems. What was not unremarkable when Elena processed the satellite data for the 5-year period from 2015 to 2020 was the discrepancy she found between the groundwater depletion rate her remote sensing measurements indicated and the withdrawal volumes reported in the official basin water use records maintained by Curtis Holloway's office. The discrepancy was not small. The satellite data indicated groundwater depletion at a rate approximately 40% higher than the official records accounted for across the study period, a gap representing, when converted to volume, an amount of water that was substantial enough that it could not, in Elena's assessment, be explained by measurement error or natural variability in the remote sensing methodology. She ran the numbers 4 times over 3 months, each time expecting to find the error that would close the gap, and each time arriving at the same result. The official records said less water was leaving the basin than the satellite said was leaving the basin, and the difference was too large and too consistent across 5 years to be anything other than either a systematic error in the official records or a systematic omission. Elena was a scientist and not an investigator, and her first instinct was not to call law enforcement but to call the Nevada State Engineer's Office, which held oversight authority over county water commissioners across the state, and to describe what she had found as a possible data discrepancy requiring review. The state engineer's office responded within 2 weeks with a letter thanking her for the notification and indicating that the office would review the basin records on its next scheduled inspection cycle, which was 18 months away. Eleanor wrote back to say that she believed the discrepancy warranted more immediate attention. The state engineer's office responded to her second letter with the same first letter, reworded. She then called her university's legal counsel, who told her that the appropriate next step was to document her findings in a formal academic paper submitted for peer review, which would produce a credentialed and reviewable record that could be used by oversight authorities as a basis for action. Elena submitted the paper in November of 2021. It was accepted and published in the Journal of Hydrology in February of 2022. 3 days after publication, she received a call from an attorney in the Nevada Attorney General's office who had read the paper and who asked her with the directness that she found after 18 months of trying to get anyone to engage with the numbers, almost physically relieving, whether she would be willing to serve as a technical expert in a formal investigation of the Redstone Basin Water Commissioner's records. She said yes before the attorney had finished the sentence. Curtis Holloway, the water commissioner of Redstone Basin, had held the position since 1996, appointed by the county commission after spending 12 years as a junior engineer at the Nevada Division of Water Resources, where he had developed the specific and technical competence in aquifer hydrology and water rights administration that the commissioner's role required, and that had, in 26 years of holding it, never been seriously questioned by anyone with the authority to question it. He was 63 years old in 2022, married to a woman named Beverly who taught 3rd grade at the county elementary school, a member of the Lutheran Church on Commerce Street, and the owner of a recreational vehicle he took out to the desert 3 or 4 times a year with a group of friends who described him in the weeks after his arrest with a consistency that investigators found both genuine and disorienting, as the most knowledgeable and least pretentious man any of them had ever known on the subject of water, as a man who could read a topographic map of an aquifer the way other people read a room, and who had always, in their experience, cared deeply about the health of the basin and the viability of the farms that depended on it. The investigation's forensic accounting team, which spent 4 months reconstructing the financial architecture Holloway's scheme before the arrest was made, found 3 corporate entities that had been purchasing water at below market rates from accounts that did not appear in any official basin record, accounts that Holloway had maintained in a parallel set of records kept not in the county water office, but on a personal server in his home office, a server that the search warrant turned up behind a false panel in a closet that his attorney would later argue, unsuccessfully, was not a false panel, but simply an alcove with a piece of furniture in front of it. The 3 corporations were registered in Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming respectively, each operating names under that sounded, at first glance, like standard Western agricultural entities, and each turned out, on investigation, to be a subsidiary of a single parent company, incorporated in the Cayman Islands, whose beneficial ownership the financial investigators spent 11 trying to establish and eventually traced, through 4 layers of corporate structure, to a private equity fund headquartered in Connecticut that had been acquiring agricultural water rights across 6 western states since 2008 as part of a long-term asset strategy predicated on the expectation that water scarcity in the western United States would make those rights purchased cheaply now worth multiples of their acquisition price within a generation. The fund's investment thesis was not itself illegal. Water rights speculation is a legal activity, controversial in its ethics and consequential in its effects on rural agricultural communities, but not criminal. What made the Redstone Basin transactions criminal was not that someone was acquiring water. Rights at below market rates, but that the water being acquired had already been allocated to other users, that those other users believed their allocations were intact, that the public record said the allocations were intact, and that the only reason the public record said so was that Curtis Holloway was maintaining two sets of records and had been doing so for 15 years. The forensic analysis produced, alongside the financial evidence, a secondary record that was in some ways more difficult to look at than the bank transfers, because it was a record of specific farms and specific families and the specific years in which their situations had changed in ways they had attributed to drought and commodity price fluctuation and the ordinary brutal mathematics of small-scale agriculture in a region where the margin for error is narrow in the best years and non-existent in the bad ones. There were 41 farms whose allocation records the investigation identified as potentially affected by the diversion. Of those, 33 had experienced significant documented financial stress in the years following 2007. The year the investigation established as the beginning of Holloway's diversion scheme. Of the 33, 6 had gone out of operation entirely, their land either sold under financial pressure or lost to foreclosure. The families connected to those 6 farms were contacted by the Attorney General's Victim Assistance Office in the summer of 2022, after the investigation had progressed far enough to establish the connection between the diversion and the agricultural failures with sufficient confidence. Those contacts produced testimony that the investigation recorded in full and that the prosecutor described in a pretrial brief filed in the spring of 2023 as the most morally significant portion of the evidentiary record, because it was the portion that converted the financial crime from an abstraction into a sequence of specific lives changed beyond recovery by decisions a man had made in a private office with a private server and a false panel behind a piece of furniture. Margaret and Don Rice, the farm the investigation connected to the 2 deaths that had caused the prosecutor to push hardest for the most serious charges in the indictment belonged to a couple named Margaret and Don Rice, who had run a 300-acre alfalfa operation in the southern part of the basin for 31 years before losing it to foreclosure. In 2017, Don Rice had died in November of 2018, 14 months after the foreclosure of what his death certificate recorded as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 62. His wife Margaret survived him, moved to Reno to live with her daughter's family, and was the person who received the Attorney General's contact letter in August of 2022 and who called the Victim Services Office the morning after receiving it. Nin, a voice that the coordinator who answered described in her case notes as the voice of someone who has been waiting for a specific word for a long time and is finally hearing it and is not sure whether to believe it yet. Margaret Rice spent 3 days on the phone with the Victim Services Coordinator before she was ready to give a formal statement, and the statement she gave when she was ready was 22 pages long, typed at her kitchen table in Reno over 2 evenings, and it began not with the foreclosure or with Don's death, but with a specific and ordinary memory, the 2 of them standing in the field in the summer of 2009, looking at the alfalfa that was growing shorter than it should have been for the water they were using, Don running his hand through the stalks and saying, quietly, that the water table felt off too. Him, that something about the way the fields were responding to the irrigation felt different from the way they had responded in the years before, in a way he couldn't quite put into words because it was the kind of difference you feel in your hands and your feet and your long experience of a specific piece of ground rather than the kind of difference you can read off a Gage. He had called Holloway's office that fall. Holloway had told him the aquifer levels were within normal variation for a drought year and that his allocation was fully intact. Don had accepted this because Holloway was the expert and because the alternative too. Accepting it was to conclude that the man responsible for protecting his water rights was lying to him, which was a conclusion that, in 2009, he had no framework for and no evidence to support. He called Holloway's office again in 2011 and in 2013, and each time received variations of the same answer. The allocation was intact. The aquifer was responding to drought conditions. This was the situation across the basin. Don continued farming on the water he had, cutting the acreage back, then cutting it back again, watching the yield numbers that had supported the farm for 30 years decline in a way that the drought alone, he increasingly felt in the same physical and experiential way he felt the water table, did not fully explain. Margaret told the victim services coordinator that Don had been a methodical man who kept detailed records, that his yield logs going back to 1988 were in a set of binders in a storage unit in Reno that she had never been able to bring herself to dispose of, and that if anyone wanted to look at them, she would provide them, and that she thought they would show very clearly that the decline in the farm's production between 2009 and 2017 tracked the diversion pattern the investigation had identified, almost year by year, a parallel record of what Holloway's private server had cost one specific farm one season at a time. Across 8 years, the investigators asked for the binders. Margaret sent all 17 of them. The forensic agricultural economist retained by the prosecution spent 6 weeks with the yield data and the irrigation logs and the water use records and produced a report whose conclusion was stated in clinical economic language and whose meaning was stark. The decline in the rice farm's productivity between 2009 and 2017 was, with a high degree of statistical confidence, inconsistent with the drought conditions and commodity prices of the period as experienced by comparable farms in the same basin whose allocations were not identified in the diversion analysis, and consistent with the same degree of confidence with a progressive reduction in effective water availability of the magnitude that the diversion scheme would have produced for an allocation of the size the rice farm held. Don Rice had not failed because of drought. He had failed because his water had been taken, systematically and invisibly, and he had been told, each time he asked, that it had not. He had spent 8 years fighting what he believed was nature and what was, in fact, a man with a keyboard and a false panel and Connecticut private equity fund's phone number. The second death. The other death the prosecution connected to the diversion scheme belonged to a man named Frank Ordaz, who had run a smaller operation on the basin's eastern edge. 60 acres of vegetable crops that he had inherited from his father and had worked for 23 years before going under in 2015. Frank had died in March of 2016, 9 months after losing the farm of what the Washoe County Medical Examiner had ruled a suicide, a finding that the Ordaz family had accepted with the specific and exhausting grief that this kind of finding leaves a family with, grief compounded by the absence of an explanation they could hold onto, because Frank had not left a note and had not, in the weeks before his death, said anything to his wife or his brother or his 2 adult children that had prepared them for what happened. He had been, by every account, a man struggling with the loss of the farm in the ordinary, devastating way that a person struggles with the loss of the work their family has done for 2 generations, a man who was quieter than he had been and who was clearly having a hard time, but who was, as far as the people around him could tell, the kind of hard time that is survivable and that they were helping him survive. They had not been wrong about his pain, and they had been wrong about its depth, and that wrongness had lived with them ever since, until the letter from the Attorney General's office told them that some portion of the pain whose depth they had not seen had a source they had not known about, and that the farm had not failed because Frank Ordaz had failed, but because the water he had paid for and relied on had been diverted without his knowledge by the person whose job was to protect it. Frank's brother, a man named Raymond Ordaz, who was a mechanic in Sparks, told the victim services coordinator that he had spent 7 years asking himself what he should have seen and hadn't, what he could have done that he didn't, and that the letter from the Attorney General's office had not answered those questions but had relocated them, moved them from inside his own failure to inside Curtis Holloway's, and that the relocation was not comfortable and was not resolution but was, he saw it, searching for the word, more accurate. It put the weight where it belonged. He could not say 7 years later whether knowing earlier would have saved Frank. He could say that not knowing had cost his family 7 years of asking the wrong question. The arrest and trial. Curtis Holloway was arrested at his home in the county seat on a Tuesday morning in April of 2022, 6 weeks after Elena Vasquez's paper was published. 4 days after the Attorney General's investigators finished reconstructing the parallel accounting system on his home server, he was charged with 22 counts of theft by false pretenses in connection with the unauthorized water sales, 16 counts of filing false official records for the reservoir and aquifer reports he had submitted to the state engineer's office, 2 counts of wire fraud in connection with the electronic transfer of proceeds from the corporate accounts. And after the victim impact investigation was completed, 2 counts of criminal facilitation of a death by extreme recklessness, the most serious charges in the indictment and the ones his attorney fought hardest against, and that the jury, after 4 days of deliberation, convicted on along with everything else. The facilitation charges were legally novel in Nevada and had been challenged before trial into separate motions arguing that the causal chain between Holloway's water diversions and the deaths of Don Rice and Frank Ordaz was too attenuated to support criminal liability. The judge who heard those motions denied them both, writing in her ruling on the second motion that the question of causal attenuation in cases involving systematic official fraud and its consequences for victims who die without knowing the fraud has occurred. Mara Thibodeau did not tell him he was right. Criminal code does not resolve by its existing. She did not tell him he was wrong. Text, and that the legislature may eventually need to address directly, but that on the facts presented in the Holloway case, the chain of causation between the diversion scheme and the financial circumstances that led to each death was sufficiently direct and sufficiently foreseeable to survive a motion to dismiss, and that the question of whether it survived the trial was properly one for the jury. The jury decided that it did. Holloway received a sentence of 34 years in Nevada State Prison, a sentence that, at 63, his attorney described as functionally a life sentence, and that the prosecution had requested as exactly that, specifically and without euphemism. The judge declined to use that framing in pronouncing the sentence, but indicated in her sentencing remarks that the length was calibrated to reflect the duration of the scheme, the number of people affected, the deliberate and sustained nature of the deception, and the specific gravity of its consequences for the 2 men whose families were in the courtroom. She addressed the families directly, briefly, at the end of the sentencing remarks, saying only that the record now contained the truth of what had happened and that She hoped, in whatever form hope was possible in a circumstance like this one, that the truth in the record counted for something. Margaret Rice, who had driven from Reno for the sentencing, nodded. Raymond Ordaz looked at the floor. The judge closed her notes. The Connecticut Fund, the private equity fund whose subsidiaries had been purchasing Holloway's diverted water, was not charged criminally. The investigation found no evidence that the fund or its principals had known that the water they were acquiring was being sold without authorization, or that the sellers held no legitimate right to convey it. The fund's due diligence process had relied entirely on the documentation provided by the intermediary corporate structure, documentation that Holloway had fabricated with the same facility he had fabricated everything else, and had passed whatever review process the fund applied, because the review process had not included an independent hydrological audit of the source basin, an omission that, in retrospect, was either an oversight or an assumption that the official records of a licensed state water commissioner were reliable, which was an assumption that was reasonable and wrong. The fund returned the purchased water rights to the state of Nevada as part of a civil settlement reached in the fall of 2022 and paid into a remediation fund established by the Attorney General's office to compensate the affected farms and their families, a fund that provided direct payments to the families of the 41 affected farms calculated against the agricultural economists' analysis of the economic harm attributable to the diversion. The payments were not described as compensatory in the full legal sense because the settlement was a civil rather than criminal matter, and the fund's attorneys had negotiated language that avoided any explicit admission of liability for the deaths of Don Rice and Frank Ordaz. Margaret Rice declined to participate in the remediation fund. Raymond Ordaz accepted the payment on behalf of his brother's estate and donated it in full to a Nevada organization that supports farm families in financial crisis. He told the Victim Services Coordinator that keeping it was not something he could do, and that he understood the payment was not what had been taken, and that the gap between what the payment represented and what it stood in for was the gap he was going to be living in for the rest of his life, and that he preferred to put the money somewhere it might close somebody else's gap instead. Elena Vasquez, the hydrologist whose published paper had started the investigation, received, in the months following Holloway's conviction, a level of professional recognition that she described to colleagues as disproportionate to what she had actually done, which was read satellite data carefully and publish what she found. She was named to the State Engineer's Office new Independent Technical Advisory Panel, a body that had not previously existed and that was created, in significant part, as a response to the structural failure the Holloway case had exposed, the absence of any mechanism by which the State Engineer's Office could verify county water commissioner records against independent physical data without relying on the commissioner's own reporting. The panel's charter gave it access to the same remote sensing data that Elena had been using in her academic research, and a mandate to flag discrepancies between satellite-derived depletion estimates and official basin records on a quarterly basis, a monitoring function, if it had existed in 2007, would have produced a flag in Redstone Basin within the first year of Holloway's diversion and might have cost Don Rice 7 years of mounting debt and Frank Ordaz 9 months of the particular grief that the loss of a family farm in a drought basin which produces. They had decided without ceremony and without man who grew up watching his father moment of decision absence to set down and leave where they left them. World his family has been trying to account for, in the way families account for such absences, which is imperfectly and permanently and with a love that does not stop because the person it is directed at is no longer there to receive it. She has said that she thinks about the farms every time she runs a new basin analysis, that the Redstone data is the one she returns to most, often as a reference point, not because it is the most hydrologically interesting of her 12 study sites, but because it is the one where the numbers were not just numbers, and where the gap between the satellite data and the official record turned out to be not a measurement question, but a moral one, and where the act of looking carefully at data that nobody had asked her to look at carefully had turned out to matter in a way that her research training had not fully prepared her for, and that she is still, she says, in the process of understanding the basin's water. The Redstone Basin aquifer, freed from the diversion after Holloway's arrest, has been monitored quarterly since 2020 by the State Engineer's Office under the new protocols. The monitoring shows a gradual recovery in groundwater levels, measurable but slower than the optimistic projections the State Engineer's Office put in its press release, because the drought that has been real all along, the drought that Holloway used as cover for everything he was doing, is also real, and its effect on the aquifer cannot be repaired by stopping the theft alone. The farms that are still operating in the basin received confirmation in November of 2020 that their allocations were intact and that the monitoring data supported the restoration of full allocation volumes for the following irrigation season. The farmers who received that notification cast it, as it were, in the way farmers cast any improvement in their conditions, which is by going back into the fields and doing the work, because that is what there is to do, and because the water is there now and the work requires it, and the fields don't wait for anyone to finish their accounting of what it costs to get the water back. 3 of the 6 farms that had gone under were purchased between 2018 and 2021 by the same Connecticut fund that had been buying Holloway's diverted water acquisitions that had seemed, at the time, like distressed purchases of failed agricultural land, and that looked, in the light of the investigation, considerably more complicated. Those 3 properties were included in the civil settlements remediation provisions, and their disposition was, as of this account's compilation, still being negotiated between the fund and the Nevada Attorney General's office in proceedings that have not been made public. The families who lost them have been told that the negotiations are ongoing and that the outcome will be communicated to them when it is reached. Margaret Rice, whose farm was among the 3, has said that she does not expect to return to it, that the question of ownership is a legal one and not a personal one for her anymore, and that what the farm was, which was 31 years of her and Dawn's labor, and the place where their children grew up, and the ground they understood better than any other ground they had ever stood on, is not recoverable by any settlement regardless of how the property title is eventually resolved, and that she is not saying this as a complaint about the legal system, but as a fact about the nature of what was taken, which was not only the farm and not only the water and not only the years of work that the farm represented, but also the explanation she and Dawn had deserved in real time, the knowledge that would have told them the fight they were in was not with the weather but with a man, and that a man can be confronted in a way that the weather cannot, and that the confrontation, had it been available to them when they needed it, might have saved John Rice's life, which is the specific and unreachable loss inside every other loss that the Redstone Basin investigation produced, and the one that the record for all its 41 farm files and parallel accounting servers and satellite data and criminal convictions can document but cannot The water
close.
runs in the basin. The aquifer slowly fills. The satellite continues to measure. Elena Vasquez continues to read what it says quarterly, and the numbers now match. The official record within the margins of error that groundwater hydrology produces naturally and honestly, and the matching is what it looks like when the system is working. And the memory of what the numbers looked like when the system was not is now
Working
trying
is
to
what
close
Elena
with
carries
varying
every
resources
time she
and
opens the
varying
basin
urgency
file,
and the
which
shared.
is
Not a weight she resents, because a person who has looked carefully at data and found a wrong thing and said so and been listened to eventually, imperfectly, at the cost of years she did not have the power to give back, has a particular relationship with the data that follows, a watchfulness that is different in quality from the watchfulness of someone who has not yet found the wrong thing and whose innocence about what the numbers can contain is still, for now, intact. The commissioners, who did not look. Curtis Holloway had been appointed by the Redstone County Commission in 1996 and had been reappointed without opposition or serious review in 2002. Each reappointment had been accompanied by a brief presentation to the commission in which Holloway described the state of the basin's water resources, the allocation system's performance, and any relevant regulatory or hydrological developments. Presentations that the commission members who were
Alive
still
and
in office in 2020 to described in depositions taken as part of a civil inquiry as clear, authoritative. None of the
reassuring.
commissioners who had voted for Holloway's reappointments had, in any cycle, requested an independent technical review of his data or an audit of his records. None of them had a technical background in hydrology or water rights law sufficient to evaluate what Holloway presented. None of them had reason to suspect that the most technically specialized official in county government, the one whose expertise was the reason he held the position and the reason nobody else could do his job, was using that expertise as the instrument of a systematic fraud. The civil inquiry asked each of them directly whether they believed they should have done something different. The answers varied in their language and were similar in their substance. They had trusted the expert they had appointed because he was the expert and because the system of county governance depends on the ability of elected non-experts to rely on appointed experts, and because no mechanism existed within the county's governance structure for a non-technical oversight body to independently verify the work of a technical specialist. The Civil Inquiries Report, issued in early 2023, concluded that this dependency was rather than individual, that no specific commissioner had been negligent in any legally cognizable sense, and that the appropriate remedy was structural, the creation of an independent technical oversight position within the state engineer's office, funded by a small allocation from each county's water administration budget, whose sole function was to verify the basin-level records of county water commissioners against independently collected physical data on an annual basis. The legislature appropriated the funding for 5 such positions in the spring of 2024. Elena Vasquez was offered one of them. She declined because she is a researcher and the oversight position would have required her to stop researching, and because she believed, and said so when declining, that the most useful thing she could do for the basin water systems of Nevada was to keep looking at the satellite data and publishing what she found, which was the activity that had produced the Holloway investigation in the first place, and that the oversight positions, however necessary, were not a substitute for. She recommended 3 of her graduate students for the positions instead. 2 of them were hired. They are, as of the compilation of this account, looking at the data in -1 Nevada basins every quarter, running the reconciliation against the official records, finding what they expect to find, which is the ordinary and imperfect correspondence between what a satellite measures and what a commissioner reports in a system where the commissioner is doing their job. They know what the data will look like if the commissioner is not doing their job because their advisor showed them the Redstone Basin file on their first day of work and told them to read it carefully. They have read it carefully. They know the shape of the wrong thing. They are watching for it in 11 basins. Most of what they find is the right thing, the ordinary thing, the data. Behaving the way data behaves when nobody is adjusting it, and most of what they do is confirm that and file their quarterly report and move on to the next cycle. Every so often, one of them will be the person who finds the discrepancy. That does not close on the second analysis or the third, who sits with the number and runs it again and gets the same result, and who then has to decide what to do with a finding that challenges the assumption that the expert appointed to protect the resource is doing so honestly.
Without conflict,
they have been told by Elena Vasquez, by the state engineer's office, and by the explicit terms of their positions charter, exactly what to do in that circumstance. They have the phone number of the Attorney General's office precinct
she told a reporter
in their
the
work.
summer of 2023 that she didn't think of.
They have been told that the threshold for escalation is not certainty but reasonable documented concern. They have been told that the cost of reporting a false positive is an inconvenient audit, and that the cost of not reporting a true positive is a Curtis Holloway. They are, in the language of the oversight system, that the Redstone Basin case made necessary the people whose job it is to notice what Elena Vasquez noticed before anyone dies waiting for a journal to publish the result. Curtis Holloway is in Nevada State Prison. He has, according to the facility's records, declined to participate in any of the educational or vocational programs available to him and has had no visitors. His wife Beverly filed for divorce for months after the conviction and has remained in the county seat, where she still teaches third grade, a situation that her colleagues have described as requiring a specific and sustained courage that she does not appear to seek recognition for, which is consistent with what those same colleagues said about her before any of this happened, that she was a person who showed up every day for the children in her classroom, and that this was the thing she was for and the thing she had always been, and that the fact that it was now happening in a community that knew everything that it knew made it a different kind of showing up than it had been before. But not a different kind of person. She has not commented publicly on her former husband or on the case, and the record does not require her to. The memorial. In the summer of 2023, the Redstone Basin Agricultural Cooperative, a voluntary 28 of the basin's remaining farms, placed a small marker at the edge of the cooperative's shared water testing facility on the Seth Road, a marker that names Don Rice and Frank Ordaz and describes them in 2 lines of engraved text as farmers of Redstone Basin who deserve the water they paid for. The marker was the cooperative's idea and was placed without publicity, and most of the people who see it are members of the cooperative or their families, people who knew Don and Frank or knew of them or understood, in the specific way that farming communities understand the loss of farms, what their absence from the basin meant. The text on the marker is factual and does not describe what happened to them or name the person responsible, because the cooperative members who chose the wording decided that the marker should be about Don and Frank and not about Curtis Holloway, and that what it should say about them should be the thing that Was true and taken. They were farmers. They paid for their water. They deserved to have it. The two sentences together are both an obituary and a charge, and they will be read by people who know the context and by people who don't, and by people who will know it eventually, and by the grandchildren of cooperative members who are not yet old enough to understand any of it, and by anyone who drives the South Road in the early morning when the light comes low. Across the basin, and the fields are green or brown depending on the season. And the water and the long, specific, ordinary work of keeping a farm alive. In a high desert basin where the aquifer runs deep and the surface is dry, and the distance between enough water and not enough is the distance that a man with a private server and a piece of furniture in front of a closet had, for 15 years, been deciding without any of them knowing it. The basin's farms are still there. The water is still there. The satellite is still watching. The numbers now match. The water rights system. The Redstone Basin case exposed for the water law community that follows these matters. A structural vulnerability in the appropriation doctrine that governs Western water rights, a doctrine built on the principle of first in time, first in right, meaning that the person who first put water to beneficial use holds the senior right to it. And that right is protected against junior users in times of shortage. The doctrine is elegant and practical, and it depends entirely, for its enforcement, the accuracy of the records that the county water commissioners maintain, because the water right itself exists as a paper instrument, a certificate, whose holder is entitled to the water it describes only if the commissioner is accurately tracking what is actually in the aquifer and actually being allocated and actually being used. If the commissioner is maintaining two sets of records, one accurate and one falsified, the doctrine cannot protect any right, senior or junior, from a commissioner willing to sell it to someone whose name is not on any certificate at all. This vulnerability had been noted in the water law literature before the Holloway case. In the abstract and theoretical terms that academic literature uses for vulnerabilities that have not yet produced a case dramatic enough to make them concrete. The Holloway case made it concrete in Redstone Basin, and the Nevada legislature's response made it structurally slightly less exploitable in Nevada, and the academic literature now has a footnote that is not abstract. Whether that footnote matters in the 12 other states whose Western water administration systems share the same structural dependency on the unverified accuracy of locally accountable commissioners is a question that the legislatures of those states have not yet been required to answer, because the satellite data from those states has not yet produced a published paper that an attorney general's staff attorney reads over a weekend and finds compelling enough to call the author before the week is out. The satellite data is being collected. The papers may come. The questions will be asked of someone, eventually, in some basin, about some commissioner, and the answer will be what the answer in Redstone Basin was, which is either that the records match the physical reality, or that they do not, and that the gap, if there is one, has a size and a shape and a duration, and that the duration is the part that costs the most, because every year the gap exists is another year of farmers asking why their fields are responding wrong and being told by the expert they trust that the water is there and that this is just what drought looks like, which is almost always true and was, in Redstone Basin for 15 years, the most effective lie that a man with technical authority and a private server could tell, because it was 90% true, and the 10% that was not true was the 10% that killed to people whose families are still here, still farming or not farming, still carrying what there is to carry in a basin where the numbers now match and the memory of when they did not will not for those families close on the second analysis or the third or any analysis that anyone has yet devised. The South Road in October. Elena Vasquez drove the South Road in October of 2022, 6 months after the arrest, as part of a field verification exercise for the post-Holloway monitoring protocol. She had driven it before in 2019 during the original data collection for her study, and she had at the time noted it only in the way. Researcher notes a field site as a location associated with a set of GPS coordinates and a data point in a larger analysis. She drove it again in October of 2022 with the full knowledge of what the coordinates had turned out to represent, and she stopped a truck at the cooperative's water testing facility and read the marker that had been placed there 3 months earlier. She has said to the colleague she has discussed it with that reading it was a different experience from reading any of the documents in the case file. Different from the financial records and the falsified reservoir reports and the pathology reports. And the forensic agricultural economics analysis, because it's the simplest and most irreducible version of what the whole file, across its thousands of pages, was trying to say, which was that two men had paid for something and deserved it and did not get it, and that the reason they did not get it was a man who had decided that his private need was larger than their legal right, and who had been in the position to act on that decision for 26 years without anyone checking the math. She stood at the marker for a while. She took a photograph of it for reasons she did not fully articulate to herself and has not fully articulated since. She got back in the truck and drove back to Reno, where the satellite data for the next quarterly review was waiting for her on her university server. And she opened the file when she got back and ran the numbers for 11 basins including Redstone and Redstone matched, and she noted it in the quarterly log and moved on to the next basin, which is the work, and
the physical frame is the one that lives in the bodies
is what there is to do, and which she does with the specific and patient attention of someone who knows what the numbers look like when they do not match and has committed, for as long as the work requires it, to being the person who looks. What Margaret Rice kept among the 17 binders of yield data and irrigation logs that Margaret Rice sent to the investigative team in the fall of 2022, the forensic agricultural economist found in the last binder a set of handwritten notes that Don Rice had made across the final 3 years of the farm's operation, notes that were not yield data or irrigation logs, but something closer to a farmer's private attempt to reconcile the numbers that the land was giving him with the numbers that the official record said should have been producing those numbers. The notes were written in a terse, empirical shorthand, column dates, and water pressure readings and soil moisture estimates and crop yield projections, and at the bottom of each page, in a different pen as though added at a different time, a brief observation about what the numbers meant compared to what the same numbers had meant in previous years, observations whose tone shifted across 3 years, from puzzled to frustrated to the particular flat calm of a man who has stopped trying to understand a discrepancy and started simply recording it, because recording it is the only thing left to do with a discrepancy you cannot solve. The Economist included a brief note about the handwritten pages in her report, describing them as outside the scope of her quantitative analysis, but potentially relevant to the question of the subjective experience of the diversion's effects on the farm's management. The prosecutor read the note and requested the pages. She read them on a Sunday evening in her apartment in Carson City, and she has said since that they were the document in the case that she found most difficult to read, not because they contained dramatic or alarming content, but because they did not, because they were the record of a man doing his job carefully in impossible conditions and trying to understand why the impossible conditions were, not responding the way they should have responded to careful work, and failing to understand it not because he was inattentive, but because the information that would have allowed him to understand it was being kept from him by the person whose job it was to provide it, and that the notes, read in that light, were the record of a man having a conversation with himself about a problem he could not solve because the person who held the solution had decided to sell it to someone in Connecticut. She used a quotation from those notes in her opening statement at trial. Don Rice had written in November of 2015, 2 years before the foreclosure, the water is there on paper and something else is happening in the field, and I do not know how to make those two things agree with each other. The prosecutor read those two sentences to the jury and said nothing after reading them for a moment that several jurors would later describe in post-trial interviews as the moment the case became real to them in a way it had not been before, when the charts and the satellite data and the corporate structure diagrams resolved suddenly into a farmer standing in a field in November trying to understand why the math did not work, and not understanding it, and eventually not being there to understand anything anymore. Margaret Rice, sitting in the gallery, heard the sentence and looked at her hands, and did not look up for a while. And when she looked up, the courtroom was the same courtroom it had been before, and Curtis Holloway was the same man at the defense table he had been before, and the sentence was in the record now, which was where it belonged, and which was where Don had never intended it to go, but where the work he did all his life, the careful, recorded, empirical work of a man trying to understand what his land was telling him, had eventually, after everything, taken it. The sentence is in the transcript. The transcript is in the record. The record is in the Nevada State Court Archives in Carson City, where it will remain under the standard retention policy for criminal trial records, which is permanent. Don Rice wrote it in November of 2015. The jury heard it in October of 2023. The 8 years between those two dates are the duration of the wrong thing, measured from the inside in the handwriting of the person it was happening to. That is what the record contains. That is what was found. That is what the satellite made possible, and the journal, and the attorney who read the journal on a weekend
She
and
stays
picked
for
up
about
the
an
phone
hour and then
the
drives
farmer.
home.
And she does not. Who kept writing things down even when the writing produced no answer, because he was a careful man, and careful men keep records of what they see, and what he saw for 3 years was a discrepancy between the water on paper and the water in the field, and he could not explain it, and he never got to know why, and the why is in 44 binders in Carson City, and the binders will be there for as long as the archive is. And the basin will be monitored for as long as the monitoring continues, and the satellite will keep watching, and the numbers, for now, match. The basin in winter. The high desert in January is a specific kind of cold, dry, and still. The kind that settles into the low ground between the ranges and sits there. without wind, and the farms along the South Road are mostly quiet in that. Cold, the irrigation lines drained, the equipment stored, the fields brown or white depending on whether the snow has come, and the people who work those fields inside. Their houses doing the paperwork that farming generates in the off-season, the loan applications, and the equipment maintenance logs and the water allocation certificates that live in a file folder in a drawer somewhere because they represent, officially and on paper, the thing the farm is entitled to and the thing the farm plans around. Those certificates now mean what they were always supposed to mean, which is that the allocation they describe is the allocation in the aquifer, matched by a quarterly monitoring report and a satellite measurement, and to graduate students in Reno running the reconciliation before filing it with the state engineer's office. That is the winter now. It is different from the winters between 2007 and 2022 in the way that things are different when the ground they stand on turns out to have been solid all along, and the thing that was making it feel unsteady has been removed and named and put in a cell in Nevada State Prison, where it will remain long enough that most of the people it affected will have lived full lives in its absence, farming or not farming, remembering or not talking about it, doing what there is to do in a basin where the water is there and the numbers match and the careful people are watching.